This happened to me while I was in middle school. For background, we used to live in a crappy and old house in a crappy and old neighborhood. Our house had two types of fences. In the very back of our backyard was a tall wooden fence, and in the front and sides of the house was a generic white picket fence. The first year that we lived there, it was very quiet. We never saw many neighbors around and rarely heard anything. This changed, however, when I began to hear knocking at my window. This happened for a couple of weeks, and every time I told my parents, they didn't believe me. So I used to think our house was haunted. It creaked a lot, and I always heard weird noises which I counted as evidence. The knocking continued to get worse over the weeks. I remembered thinking that the knocking was coming from the mirror in my room, because it was so loud it sounded like it was coming from my room. I had two windows in my room, one above my nightstand and the other was right beside my bed. The knocking only came from the one above my nightstand. The window beside my bed had a giant metal AC unit underneath it with loud fans on it, and the other window had bushes below it. Looking back years later, it makes sense why it was only coming from the window near my nightstand with the bushes below it. At this point, I had confided in my younger sister about it, since my parents didn't believe me. I found out that she also heard loud knocking coming from her own windows. I did tell my parents that we both heard noises, and my dad said that he had investigated but didn't find anything. There was one night I remember very vividly. I had managed to make a pillow fort in my room with chairs and sheets and had been sleeping in it this night. It was late summer and I couldn't sleep, so I watched YouTube in my fort. I had eventually put away my phone on my nightstand, rolled over, and tried to fall asleep. That was when the soft tapping on my window started. I was used to it at this point, but I was still terrified. I laid still and waited for it to go away, but it didn't. The tapping turned into loud knocks, then soon into pounding at my window. I refused to move, and at this point I was crying. I thought the glass was going to shatter from how hard the pounding on my window had been. I had heard my window shaking as it proceeded. Eventually, it stopped. I don't know how my parents didn't hear anything. Over those few weeks, the knocking had seemed to somewhat stop, but this only led to weirder things happening. I remember looking at the bushes that were shifted weirdly under my window, and I guess that's when it really hit me that a person had been doing this, not some ghost. Other weird things had happened also. There was one night where my family had gotten home late, and I remember like straight out of a horror movie, in the large bushes under my sister's window, I had heard a phone go off. It was pitch dark outside, so I didn't see anybody at all, but I am sure that I did hear a phone ring. This also happened again later, as I heard a phone notification ding under my window a few nights later while I was in bed. Random rocks and marbles would show up outside of our house. Outside in front of our garage, we used to find large rocks, the kind you would find at a playground. Our house did not have any of them, and along with those we would find small marbles. The reason I point at my neighbor for doing all this is because he was the only neighbor we would ever see. It was rare to see him, but usually he would just be in his yard. If I had seen him or he caught me looking at him, he would move out of sight behind our larger wood fences. There was one specific day where he had really scared my sister and me. My dad had left for something, and my mom, sister, and I were the only people home. Us kids were sitting on the back porch swing as we did regularly almost. We were talking as the sun began to set. We faced towards our white fences, and at this moment I had been looking around the yard. That's when I saw him, our neighbor at the fence, peering over and watching us. I tried to ignore him until he started walking along the white fence. He paced back and forth beside our fence, watching us, not speaking. He did this for a couple of minutes before our mother noticed, I guess through the window. She made us come inside and stayed at our glass back door to watch him. He kept pacing, and after a while of him doing this and showing no signs of stopping, my mother called our grandfather to come over and my dad to come back home. Once my grandfather showed up, the neighbor left and went back into his house. After this, we didn't hear much from him. We did hear occasional knocks or did find rocks, but other than that, he stayed quiet. My fear about our neighbor being the stalker was confirmed after we had moved. The family that moved in after us had 2 sons, and I believe they were both about the same age as my sister and me. The new residents reported that once their oldest son had accidentally thrown away something and gone to find it in the garbage outside. The next morning they got a letter on the front porch, not in the mailbox. It read something along the lines of, "I saw your son last night digging through the trash. You should tell him to be more careful. You don't know who is watching." The letter was signed by the next door neighbor. I told my parents about this, and apparently the family had been experiencing similar things like I did when we lived there. It does freak me out to think about how my parents did not believe us, only for them to be proven wrong by the next family that moved in. It was a weekend in 2018, and I figured it would be a good idea to go out of town for the day and introduce my girlfriend to my mom for the first time. My mom lives out in the plains on 40 acres of land. The house and land are about 1/4 mile off the road into the field, with our long driveway dividing the land of two neighbors. We arrived around noon, and my brother and his wife also happened to be out there visiting that day, so I introduced the girlfriend to everyone and all the dogs. I noticed though that the loudest and most obnoxious dog, the beagle, didn't come greet us. My mom explained that the previous night she went to grab something from the truck, and on her way in the dog darted out the door and ran off into the field and still hadn't come back yet. This isn't all that uncommon for a dog to run off in the night and come back a couple of days later living out in the country like this. Later that day, my mom recalled to everyone that her and my nieces were woken up at around 1 a.m. to all the dogs howling and barking non-stop and just going nuts. Eventually they stopped and everybody went back to sleep. We continued to have a nice quiet day out in the middle of nowhere for a few more hours when we noticed that this hawk had been flying around the same spot all day in the field, so my brother and his wife went to check it out. A few minutes later, my brother came back and told me that he found the missing beagle, but something was wrong and that I should go check it out before telling my mom. I followed my brother into the field, expecting to find a dead dog. As we were walking, I saw a spot of blood and thought that it was probably coyotes. He showed me a trail of blood that led to a larger puddle and another trail. The dog seemed to have been drug around a bit. As soon as I saw the dog, something looked wrong about the scene, and the plants around him were trampled and something looked different. I took a few more steps and realized that he was missing skin. This wasn't just a few bits missing from a fight or birds pecking at him though. The only fur and skin left on him was the head, tail, and paws. They were very distinguished straight lines indicating that he had been skinned. Some sick person had killed, skinned, and taken a pelt of our dog in the middle of the night, only a couple of 100 feet from our front door. My mom suspects our neighbor, who she always has been creeped out by, because she's seen him skinning animals that he hunted before, such as rabbits. It seems like way too much of a coincidence for my mom's neighbor not to have been the one who did this to our dog. Of course we called the cops, who took pictures and looked around the area and noticed tire tracks, but couldn't tell how old they were. They also found a pile of fresh horse manure that looked fresh close by. It looked like whoever did this rode a horse out there, and that same neighbor does own horses on his property also. To this day, the cops have never followed up with anything, and nothing else has happened yet, even though my mom explained the neighbor's tendencies to the police. Nature cams were installed since then, and fences have been mended so our dogs can't get out. So at least we know it won't happen again, and if it does, something will be caught on camera. When I was in my very early 20s, I lived in some pretty cheap apartments that were known for being a little sketchy for the area. There was this neighbor that seemed a little bit off, I thought. But how could he be that weird if he was chilling to some old school music most of the time? I'd hear him blast his music and have loud conversations, but then again we both had studio apartments that were touching, so I would just play music not to hear his so loudly. One night he was drinking a lot and had his girlfriend around. I could hear him being belligerent, but nothing that seemed out of the ordinary for him, I suppose. It wasn't too late, so I headed out for the night with some friends while my boyfriend at the time stayed in. I got dropped back off at around 1 a.m. or so, and as we drove into the parking lot from afar, we saw my neighbor outside in between cars and the apartment looking sort of odd. At that point, my friends were more weirded out than I was, because I had been living next to the guy and had gotten used to some of the weird stuff he did. My friends dropped me off out front because it was easier to exit the parking lot without driving all the way in. They drove away and I walked up to go into my apartment, but I had to pass by my strange neighbor's apartment first. My heart dropped, because I noticed he was standing still by then with his body hidden by the bush that was between our apartments. As I approached, it seemed like he thought maybe I didn't see him because it was so dark and he was as still as a statue. I waved and mumbled hi to make him aware that I saw him there, basically like a warning for him not to try anything since no one was out on a weekday at this hour. At that point, after I acknowledged that he was there, he stepped out of the side of the bush and came into the dim-lit porch light, and never in my life have I looked into eyes like his were that night. They were widened, dark, fully dilated just like a wild animal, almost lunatic if I were to express his energy as well. He didn't say anything but gave me a bone-chilling look, and I ran into my apartment immediately. My boyfriend was drowsy since it was late, but he did say the neighbor's music was loud and continued for some time. He said he had heard a ton of noise and arguing earlier but didn't think anything of it. That night, all night we heard thumps from my neighbor's apartment. It also sounded like furniture was moving. It just weirded me out knowing that he was awake in the state that I viewed him in, which seemed almost primal. The next morning, I heard the cops outside banging on his door. I was partially relieved to see them, but then super scared of why they were there in the first place. They took him away in handcuffs shortly after demanding to be let in, and the cops asked me when the last time I talked to him or saw him was. I told them about the previous night, the arguing, the noises, the frightening encounter that I had, and the thumping all night. What I found out during the next day really creeps me out. I was told from the groundskeeper details, and I will keep them simple as it was horrendous. That chill, old-school music-listening neighbor had brutally murdered his girlfriend that night. He dismembered parts of her and dragged the rest of her body near the train tracks which were directly behind our apartments. It hit me that the cold, primal, wide-eyed look I had seen was that of a man who had just took another human being's life. I felt so sad for the woman who did not deserve to go like that. She was always quiet, sweet, and seemed a bit down on her luck usually, asking for cigarettes when I encountered her. To this day, it really creeps me out thinking about how close I was to death, quite literally. He could have ambushed me out of insanity since he was just waiting in the darkness when I walked up to my apartment. I recently moved to Florida from Pennsylvania for my job. All my friends and family are still in Pennsylvania, so I live by myself, which can get spooky. My second week in Florida, I met my next-door neighbor, Eddie. He seemed like a relatively normal guy in his 70s, very quiet and polite. One day, they turned the water off in the whole complex for repairs without notice, so I went over to Eddie's to ask if his water was off too. He answered the door and proceeded to talk to me for about a half hour. I obliged because I hadn't seen him get any visitors and I assumed that he was lonely. Towards the end of the conversation, though, it started to get creepy. He said that he was on his balcony one day watching the neighbor girl across from her window as she took bikini pictures. He then said, "If I had daughters, I'd be constantly scared that they were doing that. You don't scare your dad like that, do you?" It put a bad taste in my mouth, but I just attributed it to his loneliness. A few days later, a looming shadow appeared in front of me, and I saw Eddie briefly looking in my windows. To my knowledge, he only had an ex-wife with no kids, partner, or family. Fast forward a couple of weekends when my boyfriend came to visit me, and we were out all day at the flea market. I came back to a note on my door from Eddie which said I had a package delivered and he had picked it up for me. My boyfriend went to the bathroom and I went next door to pick up my package. I knocked and there was no answer. Later, Eddie came to my door in the shortest robe ever and said that he had been in the shower. I said, "Oh, okay, thanks for picking up my package," and before I could close the door, Eddie mentioned that my boyfriend and I didn't need to be quiet that night. You can guess what he was insinuating, and it was a very odd comment to make. Fast forward to about 2 weeks when I got home from work one day. The people from my apartment's office were up on my landing in front of my door, which I assumed was a maintenance repair I had reported, but I didn't understand why it took 3 of them. I walked up the stairs, and they asked me when the last time I had seen Eddie was. I told them about the encounter 2 weeks prior. I entered my apartment, and a few minutes later, they knocked on my door and asked me if the man on a scan of an ID was my neighbor, to which I confirmed. After that, I went to the store to pick up some ice, and when I returned, there were 2 police cars in the parking lot. I approached the stairs, and everyone on the landing was looking at me. When I got up the stairs, the officer asked me when the last time I saw Eddie was. I reiterated my previous answer and went back to my apartment and started my nightly cleaning. Around 10 minutes later, a different cop knocked and asked the same question, to which I answered as well. I guess I was the last person to report seeing him. My neighbor Eddie had died. Apparently, it was likely that it was a week or 2 before they found him. He must have not had anyone to check on him in that time. I also felt bad for not checking on him because I hadn't seen him for a while, but I just attributed it to opposite schedules, and after the weird comments, I wasn't planning on talking to him. In his apartment, the police had found a lot of pictures of me coming and going from my place that had been developed from a throwaway camera. The creepiest part is that I had been hearing sounds from the wall that our apartments share, knocking sounds, even though no one currently lives there since he died. Looking back, that was very creepy. This happened about 10 years ago when I was 15 years old on summer break. I grew up in a very run-of-the-mill middle-class neighborhood in San Antonio. Our house sat on a corner. and the fence around the backyard had horizontal wood beams that made almost an X, as opposed to the more common vertical fence post. Because of this, there were larger gaps in between the beams, and seeing through was fairly easy. Another detail worth noting, our back gate on the side of the house near the road had been wide open many mornings. Because of this, my dad had looped some wire through the latch and twisted it like a bread tie to keep it engaged and closed, but we would still find it open. In the backyard, there was a large deck and an above-ground pool that the deck was built up to on one end. A huge, beautiful oak tree shaded the deck and the part of the pool that was closest to the house, so my sister and I would anchor our feet to the farthest edge and sunbathe on our floats near the fence. This happened on a Sunday. My grandfather was visiting, and he and my parents were inside napping. My older sister was gone with her friends to a different pool, and I decided to go float in the backyard on my own. My mom closed the blinds to the back and habitually locked the back door before laying down on the couch to snooze. I was in the pool for maybe 20 minutes, and I could see that someone was standing on the other side of the fence looking in. The sun was shining in my face, and I couldn't see him well, and I found it weird but didn't say anything. I saw him walk off, and I didn't think much about it. Minutes passed, and I decided to swim around a bit to cool off and then go back on the float. This time I was positioned so that I was looking up at the house instead of towards the fence. It felt like only a minute passed before I heard wood creaking behind me. I turned around, and this man was halfway over our back fence, maybe 15 feet away from me once he would get to the ground. Part of me was in shock, and I froze for a moment before sheer terror and panic took over. I realized that this was not a dream and this was really happening, and I needed to get inside now. I felt as though the pool became Olympic-sized, and I could not get to the edge and climb out fast enough. By the time I made it out of the pool and started running to the back door, the man had made his way around the pool and was also up on the deck coming towards me. He was maybe in his late 20s or 30s, thin and around 6 feet tall. He just walked the entire time and never spoke. I got to the door and it was locked, so I started screaming, let me in," as I pounded on the door. My mom was right there to unlock it very quickly, and when she opened the door, the man was just standing right behind me with this blank look in his eyes. I was crying, my grandpa was freaking out, and the man was just standing there looking inside of our house. My dad came downstairs and went crazy, screaming at the man and pushed him while telling him to leave our property. My mom was on the phone with the police at this point, and the next moment makes the whole thing 10 times creepier. The man got up off the ground where my dad had pushed him and walked over around the house to the back gate, which had the wire in the latch. He untwisted it and pushed through, leaving the gate wide open, and walked back across the street and into our neighbor's house. The police arrived, and it turned out that the man had been staying with his sister for the past 8 weeks and was on parole. However, he had recently been released from jail for theft and assault charges. He had also broken into a different neighbor's home and stolen some fine china and a few of their family photos. He went back to jail, and we never found our back gate left open again. I still get chills thinking about it because my sister and I both had our bedrooms downstairs with our windows facing the backyard, and I just know he was coming in our yard and watching us at night. My parents moved out of that home a few years later, and I went to college. I slept upstairs on a pull-out couch for months after the incident, and will never live on a ground floor again if I can help it.